Imagine a frozen river under a sky with no stars. The snow's starting to fall, the wind is just howling, and the very idea of a new nation is hanging on by a single frayed thread. This is the story of that crossing, a night that would literally change everything. So, the date is December 25th, 1776. It's a brutal Christmas night, and while their enemy is warm and celebrating, a small, completely beaten-down army is about to try something that everyone thought was impossible. This wasn't just another fight. No, this was a last-ditch, desperate gamble for the survival of the cause itself. Just days before this moment, these exact words from Thomas Paine's brand new pamphlet, The American Crisis, were actually read out loud to Washington's soldiers. Can you imagine hearing that? A perfect, brutal reminder of everything that was at stake, read to the very men whose souls were about to be tested by ice, by snow, and by war. To really get how audacious this was, we have to understand just how bleak things were. By late 1776, the cause for independence wasn't just failing, it was basically on life support, about to be extinguished for good. The last few months had been just a relentless series of disasters. One thing after another. A humiliating defeat at Long Island, the crushing loss of Fort Washington, then a desperate retreat from Fort Lee. The Continental Army was shattered, just bleeding men and supplies as they ran south through New Jersey, trying to avoid one last big fight they knew they couldn't possibly win. And at the head of this broken army was a commander whose leadership was now, in serious doubt. After so many mistakes, the whispers in the Continental Congress were getting louder. Some were openly questioning if Washington was competent, even suggesting he be replaced by generals with more experience, guys like Charles Lee or Horatio Gates. And the weight of all this was immense and deeply personal. Watching the disaster at Fort Washington from across the river, knowing it was his responsibility, his own officers saw him just completely overcome with grief. He was literally watching the cause die right in front of his eyes. And then, just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. The British captured General Charles Lee, the guy some people wanted to replace Washington with, and a commander the British themselves thought was way more dangerous. For the British, this was it. This was the final blow. They figured the rebellion was crushed, and the war was pretty much over for the year. So, with his army just dissolving, his leadership being questioned, and his best general captured, Washington was completely cornered. All the normal options were gone, and it was in this moment of total defeat that a new idea was born. Not from strategy, really, but from sheer desperation. He had to do something unthinkable. He had to risk everything on one audacious gamble. Washington's one and only advantage was something he saw in his enemy, their arrogance. The British command was so sure they had won. See, in Europe, professional armies just didn't fight major campaigns in the middle of winter. They saw the Continentals as a disorganized mob, totally incapable of a real threat. So General Howe went back to his comfortable life in New York, leaving his hired Hessian troops scattered in winter outposts, completely unsuspected. The plan he came up with was, frankly, breathtaking, so complex, so ambitious. It was a coordinated, three-pronged attack, all under the cover of darkness. Two smaller groups would cross the river at different spots to block any reinforcements and cut off any escape routes. And at the same time, Washington himself would lead the main force, 2,400 men, across that treacherous river, march 9 miles south, and hit the Hessian garrison at Trenton right before sunrise. But, a plan on a piece of paper is one thing. Actually doing it on a frozen river in the dead of winter, that's something else entirely. The army wasn't just up against the enemy, they were fighting the elements themselves. As the men got to the riverbank, the conditions they found were just horrifying. The Delaware was swollen, the current was fast and angry. But even worse, it was choked with these massive, jagged chunks of ice that could have easily crushed their boats. And then, as if nature itself was just against them, a brutal snowstorm, a full-on nor'easter, blew in, blinding the men and turning a really hard crossing into an absolute nightmare. They were supposed to be across the river by midnight. Instead, the last man, the last cannon, didn't make it to the New Jersey side until 4 in the morning. 4 hours behind schedule. Think about that. For a surprise attack, this is a catastrophe. With a 9-mile march still ahead of them, any hope of striking before dawn was completely gone. And that march that followed, it was just a pure test of survival. The storm was still raging, a lot of the soldiers were barely clothed, some had just rags wrapped around their feet instead of boots, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. The cold was so intense, so deep, that 2 men simply froze to death on the way. They died before a single shot was even fired. It was almost 8 a.m., well after sunrise, when they finally got to the edge of Trenton. They were exhausted, frozen, hours late. The plan was a mess, the element of surprise was surely lost. But then, an incredible twist of fate turned their biggest problem into their greatest advantage. That same brutal nor'easter that had nearly ruined the mission, it had also convinced the Hessians that no army on Earth could possibly be on the march. Their guards, blinded by the snow and trying to get out of the wind, couldn't see the Americans coming. They just couldn't imagine anyone would be crazy enough to attack in these conditions. The storm, it had become the perfect camouflage. When Washington finally gave the order, the attack was shockingly fast. The 1st Hessian Guards were completely overwhelmed. Then General Sullivan's division hit them from a second direction, just creating total chaos. At the same time, Henry Knox's artillery, set up perfectly at the top of the main streets, started blasting cannon fire right down the middle of town. The Hessians, scrambling out of their barracks, were completely outmaneuvered and finally surrounded in an apple orchard. And the results of this battle, well, they're just staggering. Take a look at these numbers. The Hessians had over 100 men killed or wounded and nearly 1,000 taken prisoner. And the American casualties? 4 wounded. Not a single American soldier was killed in the fight. It was an absolutely stunning, almost unbelievable lopsided victory. And this victory, it really shows us something profound, doesn't it? How a single moment, just one audacious act, can change the entire direction of a war. That's all it took. 1 hour. After months of devastating retreat, after a night of impossible struggle, this huge, monumental victory was won in just a single hour of fighting. The news just spread like wildfire. This incredible win against impossible odds, it revived the dying cause of liberty. It brought in new recruits, it convinced old soldiers to re-enlist. And the British, who thought the war was all but over, were shocked. They knew now they were in for a real fight. The entire momentum of the revolution had just shifted. It leaves us with a question that kind of echoes through history, doesn't it? What is that moment? What is that spark that turns the tide from certain defeat to the mere possibility of victory? Well, for the Continental Army on that Christmas night, the answer was crystal clear. When all hope seemed frozen solid in the ice of the Delaware River, it was courage that moved them forward.